everyone, welcome back to day 13 lecture of how to learn DevOps and cloud computing in 50 days. In today's lecture, we are going to learn about GitHub Actions, and we will also understand why GitHub Actions is commonly used. And we will also compare GitHub Actions with Jenkins. As we have done number of lab exercise using Jenkins, we will try to understand the difference between these two. And then we will also go ahead and then understand components of GitHub Actions. And then once we understand the different components of GitHub Actions, we will go ahead and then implement a CI/CD pipeline for the Java web app that we have already configured in GitHub. And then once the pipeline is configured, we will automate the build and then automate the deployment and finally deploy the Java web app into a Tomcat web container. Awesome. First of all, why do we need GitHub Actions? So let's say that you are working, with a team as a DevOps engineer. So they are developing, some website or applications or some kind of a services. They are only using GitHub as a SCM tool. So they are not using, any other SCM tool such as Bitbucket or GitLab or Azure Reports or anything like that. So they are purely using GitHub as a source code repository. So you have various options in order to implement CI and CD, correct? So you can use Jenkins, or you can use Circle CI, or you can use, Azure DevOps. So you have so many options in order to implement CI and CD. But the great thing about GitHub Actions is GitHub also has this amazing ability to implement CI/CD workflow for the projects that you have already configured in GitHub repository. So you don't have to go for any third party or any external CI/CD tool in order to implement continuous integration and continuous delivery. All you have to do is go ahead and then implement your CI/CD workflow by writing YAML file. So using that YAML file, you would be able to implement the entire CI/CD workflow. So another great thing about GitHub Actions is it doesn't matter, right, what kind of technology stack that you are using to implement your website or services. It could be Java or Node.js or PHP or Python. It doesn't matter. GitHub Actions supports pretty much all the technology stack. And then GitHub Actions is purely based on events. For example, whenever a developer commits the code, so that is actually a push action, right? So you can actually configure your CI/CD workflow to be triggered based on that push event. Similarly, let's say that a development team is actually creating a PR. So you can also implement your CI/CD workflow based on this event as well. Last but not the least, GitHub Actions have amazing reusable actions, right? For example, there are a lot of actions which have been already implemented by the community. So all you have to do is you can just simply reuse them. For example, if you want to integrate with SonarQube, all you have to do is go to the GitHub Actions marketplace, search SonarQube. You would be able to find the code for integrating SonarQube from GitHub Actions. Similarly, let's say you want to integrate with Slack because you wanted to send push notifications using GitHub Actions. So you can go to GitHub Actions marketplace, look for Slack, and then you can actually get the sample code which you can implement in your CI/CD workflow. So in a nutshell, if you are working for a team, they are completely using GitHub as a SCM tool. You don't even need to go for any external CI/CD tool. You can actually leverage GitHub Actions itself, in order to implement CI/CD workflow. So that's a great thing about GitHub Actions. So now let's try to understand the difference between GitHub Actions and Jenkins. So first of all, how would you, configure GitHub Actions? So GitHub Actions is actually built part of GitHub platform itself. So you don't need to, create a separate virtual machines or anything like that in order to configure GitHub Actions. But when it comes to Jenkins, that actually, needs a separate installation altogether, right? Whether you are going to run Jenkins in a VM as a separate installation, or let's say you want to configure Jenkins, as a Docker container, you still need to have that VM, correct? And when it comes to CI/CD implementation, GitHub Actions is pretty straightforward. all you have to do is, create your CI/CD workflow using YAML. So that is pretty much straightforward, right? But when it comes to Jenkins, you have several options, correct? You have to create, a Jenkins file, or you have to create a freestyle job. So you have so many options, right? When it comes to implementing your workflow, and then all your configurations, Jenkins configurations are stored in the XML file. And then where you're going to run your build. So that's a great thing about GitHub Actions. So GitHub Actions provides you two different type of build agents, which is nothing but runners. So GitHub also have their own runners called GitHub hosted runner, or you also have self-hosted runner where, if you want to have more control over the runner, you can also configure self-hosted runner. But GitHub hosted runner, you won't be able to manage. Everything is actually managed by the platform itself. But when it comes to Jenkins, yes, you have to set up the slave machine, correct? So whenever you configure Jenkins, so that is actually your master, right? Which is nothing but your controller. But how are you going to configure your slave or build agents? That is something you'll have to configure additionally, right? So that's kind of, a difference between these two. And then GitHub Actions have, amazing, marketplace, right? If you wanted to integrate with any third-party tool, all you have to do is, go to GitHub Actions marketplace, and then you would be able to leverage the actions, created by the community members. But when it comes to Jenkins, if you wanted to integrate any third-party tool, you'll have to actually install plugins, right? So Jenkins has like, close to 2000 plugins. You just have to install the plugins, and then, you would be able to integrate with, any third-party tool. And when it comes to usage, GitHub Actions is pretty much free for public, based repositories. But when it comes to Jenkins, that is also kind of, open source and then free to use. And then if you wanted to use, for GitHub Actions, right? If you wanted to use any private repositories, so there is a separate kind of a cost, right? Which you'll have to actually, refer the documentation. All right. So yeah, so basically, just to summarize, let's say that you're working for a company. If they are using GitHub as a SCM tool, the best option for you to implement CI/CD is to leverage GitHub Actions. Why? Because it is actually built into the platform itself. Fantastic, guys. Let's move on. So now let's try to understand the different components of GitHub Actions. So first of all, how do you think you can trigger your GitHub Actions CI/CD workflow? Using something called event. So how do you think you can trigger the event? Based on two events primarily, right? It could be git push, or let's say that, a development team is creating a pull request. So based on that also, you can actually trigger your CI/CD workflow. And then you also have a runner 1 and then runner 2. So what does that mean? If you want, you can actually, split your CI/CD workflow to run on two different build agents if needed. Okay. So for example, you have a job 1. Okay. So that can be like, build, or this can be like deployment job, right? And then you have steps, and then each step would have action, right? So for example, let's say you want to perform a build. So this could be like a build. Now let's say, you are building a Java based project, right? So you need to first check out, correct? So that is your step number 1, and then action. And then step number 2, let's say you wanted to, build, right? So something like that. Okay. So basically you have an event, and then you have a runner where the build would be, running, and then you have a job, and then each job you would have steps, and then each step you can have, action. So that is how it actually goes. Okay. Not a problem. We are going to actually, create a CI/CD workflow for a Java web app that we have already configured in GitHub, right? So if you look at this diagram, so this is exactly what I'm talking about, right? So what we are going to do right now, we are going to create a CI/CD workflow for the Java web app that we have already configured in GitHub. So using GitHub Actions, okay, so we are going to, check out the code from GitHub, and then we are going to build using Maven, and then we are going to create a Java war file, using Maven, and then we are going to deploy the Java web application inside Tomcat web container. So we are going to completely automate the build as well as deployment in this simple workflow. Fantastic, guys. So now let's get started with the demo. Let me take you guys to the instructions. So if you look at the instructions, right? So let's first quickly go through the prerequisites. Yes, you need to have Tomcat up and running, right? So this is my Tomcat, which is already configured, which is up and running in AWS Cloud. And then you also need to configure credentials inside Tomcat. So let me quickly show you. I'm already connected to Tomcat EC2 instance using iTerm. And you can see here, so I have already created a user called Tomcat and then password as a password. This user have manage a script role. So using this, username and password, we should be able to deploy from GitHub Actions into this Tomcat. Okay. All right. Fantastic. And then we also have our Java project configured. So that is nothing but this one, right? So this is our Java project already configured in GitHub. Fantastic, guys. So now let's go ahead and then, create a CI/CD workflow using GitHub Actions. So first thing first, since we are going to, use these credentials for Tomcat, we have to store them as secrets inside GitHub Actions. So that's the beauty of, GitHub. They provide you, the secret options. So they provide you option to store your, password or API keys or any sensitive information that you think that needs to be encrypted. You can actually leverage, secrets available in GitHub itself. So how do you do that? Let's actually go to our GitHub repository and then go to settings. So look for secrets, click on actions. There you go. So we are going to create a repository secret. So click on new. So let's start, creating a secret for our Tomcat user. So Tomcat user is Tomcat. Add it. And then let's add one more secret called Tomcat password. And then let's put our password. So just to note one point. Now let's say, you forgot something you wanted to edit. When you try to edit, it is not going to display, obviously. So you would be able to only update, right? So if you forgot something, you would be able to only update. You would not be able to see the existing value. Okay, so just remember that. So let's also go ahead and then add one more user. Let's also go ahead and then add one more variable called Tomcat host. And then we are going to add our URL. Okay. That's it. And then you don't have to mention the protocol. So make sure, you mention the DNS name and then the port number. Perfect. Click on add secret. Awesome, right? So we got, all these secrets configured. Okay. So now we can go ahead and then, implement CI/CD workflow. So now go back to repository here. Okay. And click on actions. You all see actions. So do you all see actions? So now you have so many options here, right? So now how do you create, CI/CD workflow for deploying your Java web application inside Tomcat? So unfortunately for, integrating with Tomcat, if you type Tomcat, so you're not actually getting much, isn't it? So not a problem, but we can still, implement CI/CD workflow. So let's get started on that. Okay. So yes, we are going to, create workflow ourselves. So click on set a, workflow on yourself. So yes, we are going to go ahead and then, create a workflow ourselves. So just click on this link. So as you can see here, right? it immediately trying to create this file, YAML file, and then this is very important, right? So whenever you are implementing CI/CD YAML file using GitHub Actions, it has to be inside these folders, right? You need to have .github folder, and then you also need to have workflows folder inside .github, and then this is your YAML file. So I'm going to say CI/CD YAML file. Okay, you can give any name, but make sure you give some sensible name. All right, fantastic. So now let's start implementing our workflow. So first thing first, right? Let me start with the name. So I'm going to say implement a CI/CD workflow for a Java web app using GitHub Actions and Maven. Perfect. So now let's go ahead and then continue here. So if you remember, we are going to trigger based on push event, right? Okay, so you're going to say on colon and then 2 space. Please remember 1, 1, 2. Okay, and then colon, and then where you want to trigger, right? So we want to trigger on branches. So you're going to say branches, and which branch? Main. And then you can say workflow dispatch, because sometimes you also want to trigger, let's say you're developing this workflow, you wanted to manually run it, so you have to add that. Okay, workflow dispatch. Perfect. Now we can go ahead and then mention jobs. So make sure it is equivalent to on here, right? So let's go ahead and then say jobs, and then what is the job name, right? The job name is going to be build. Okay, colon, and this is where we are going to specify our build agent. So we are going to use GitHub hosted agent. Yeah, so this is the right syntax. I know I had some issue over here, so this should be straight to push. Okay, perfect. So if you actually see here, right, so this is the event. Okay, so that is how this will be triggered, and then you have a jobs, and then this is the a job name, right? So right after job we are going to have step and then action. So what is the step? So I'm going to call this as steps because we have more than one steps. Okay, so let's have that written here. So I want to do a checkout. So now let's say you don't know how to check out using GitHub Actions. So not a problem. You can actually go to Marketplace. You can just type here, right? You can say checkout. So now there you go. So now, so that's the code for you to check out, from GitHub repository, right? So it's pretty straightforward. But I have already written over here. So let's say users, and then whatever the tag name, right? I know we saw over there, checkout at version 4 there, but that's fine. So you can use 3 also here, not a problem. So that's it, right? So this should take care of checking out from GitHub repository. Since we are actually working on a Java based project, we need to make sure that the agent has a JDK installed. So let's add another step here in order to install JDK. So I'm going to say setup JDK 11, and then again, right? So if you wanted to install a JDK, so go to the marketplace and then type this setup Java. There you go. So based on the Java version, you can modify that, right? So it is actually pretty straightforward there. So not a problem. I have already implemented over here. Okay, so I'm going to say I wanted to install 11 at least for this particular demo. So I'm going to copy and paste that. Perfect. So this should take care of installing JDK. Awesome. So before I go too far, let's first make sure this basic workflow is really working before I go too far, so that you're not running into too many issues. So let me click on commit changes. So I'm going to say implement CI/CD workflow. Let me click on commit changes now. So as soon as you actually commit the code, because since it was a push event, this would trigger the build instantly. I understand, I'm actually, implementing the code using GitHub interface, but it is highly recommended that, you actually use your VS Code in order to implement the CI/CD workflow. Wow. So can you all see here, guys? So now we were able to completely, check out the code, and then we were also able to install Java as well here, JDK 11. And even before that, you can also see here. So look at the agent, right? So you can see here, so we are using Ubuntu latest. So in our case, it is actually using, this operating system. So this is the image name. Okay. So we are actually using GitHub hosted runner, where the entire build is happening. Fantastic. I think so far so good. So let's continue implementing our workflow. So the next, step is, so I'm going to go ahead and then copy this. So make sure this is completely error free, and you can see here, right? Perfect. So this should take care of building the code using Maven. And then let's also go ahead and then add the code for deploying into Tomcat. So if we actually see here how we are going to deploy into Tomcat, so you can clearly see here, right? So I'm using curl command, and then I'm passing the username, and then I'm also passing the password. So this is how you can actually read values from the secrets that we have configured. And then the target URL is this, right? So I'm deploying this war file, and then where I'm deploying into a Tomcat host, so which is over here, right? And then this is the path. So this already been tested, not a problem. Let me go ahead and then copy the code. Perfect. So you can clearly see here, this is how you can actually deploy the war file into Tomcat. So this is where we are actually, reading the user credentials. This is where we are reading the password. And then this is where, we are getting the Tomcat URL, right? So everything have been configured as secrets. Okay. And then the war file would be deployed inside web apps folder. And then this is the path. This is where, it is going to pick up the war file from the build agent, and it is actually going to deploy inside the Tomcat, right? And then this is the context path. Okay. So that's it. So now let's go ahead and then, save this file, commit changes. Okay. Click on commit changes. So as soon as we commit the code, this should trigger the workflow. Let's see. So you can see here, it already, started performing build. Let's see. Wow, it's already done, guys. So we can also see here, we are completely uploaded and fine, isn't it? So this kind of confirms that the application have been deployed successfully into a Tomcat server. Wonderful. And we already saw, the green tick mark, right? So all we have to do is, go ahead and then verify the deployment. So let's go into Tomcat. Okay. So you can see here, right? Now let's do one thing. Let's quickly make some code changes as we have implemented everything cleanly now. So let me go into my web app. So I understand, guys, I'm actually making code changes through GitHub user interface, but make sure, you use your favorite editor, web app, commit changes, testing, CI/CD workflow, commit changes. Fantastic. So we can see here that, the task is done. So just go back to Tomcat, click on refresh. Wow. So yes, guys, so this is how you can actually, create a CI/CD workflow using GitHub Actions in order to deploy Java web application inside Tomcat container. I hope this lecture was useful. I'm really looking forward to meet you all in the next lecture. Thank you so much.